What's going on, comic fam? It's your boy, the Bearded Comic Bro, and today we're doing another villain profile video. In this video series, I'll take Batman villains and I break them down. I talk about their appearances in movies and TV and pop culture, and then I recommend 5 comic books that I recommend you should check out if you want to dig deeper into these characters. And today, we are talking about one of my favorite villains, Mr. Freeze. So with that being said, let's talk comics. If you're new to this series, I highly recommend checking out some of the past videos. We talked about the Riddler, Killer Croc, Clayface, Two-Face. Just a lot of fun. But today we're going to be talking about Mr. Freeze. Mr. Freeze was first introduced to us in Batman issue 121. He was created by Bob Kane and Sheldon Moldoff. But that actually isn't the first time we meet Mr. Freeze. This is actually the first appearance of Mr. Zero. That's right, gang. He's not called or referenced Mr. Freeze until he appeared in February 1966 in the TV series Batman, the Adam West TV series, and he was in an episode called Instant Freezer, and that is when they call him Mr. Freeze. So he doesn't actually appear as Mr. Freeze in comic books until March of 1968 in an issue of Detective Comics 373, which is his second appearance in comic books. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the TV show, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the comics in just a little bit. So let's talk Batman 66. Mr. Freeze appeared in 3 episodes of the Batman TV series. Technically it was 6, but if you remember Batman 66 show, what they would do is they'd air an episode on like a Tuesday, and then the next day on Wednesday they'd air the second episode. And so it was like they were always caught in a peril and be like, whoa, will Batman and Robin escape? Tune in, same bat channel, same bat time. So if you're watching them, yes, it's actually 6 episodes, but I put it together as a 40-minute episode because they go together, so I don't separate. And what's fun about this is Mr. Freeze was actually portrayed by 3 separate actors. So we first see Mr. Freeze in 1966 Batman, and he was in this episode called Instant Freezer, and his first time he was portrayed by an actor called George Sanders, and he was in this kind of iteration of a spaceman suit, and it looked really weird, but kind of cool. And you get this kind of, where you start to see Batman in Comics 121, Batman 121, and start to see it in the TV series. He's just your run-of-the-mill Batman villain with this gimmick of he shoots ice, he has ice puns, and very much what you get in Batman and Robin in the 1997 movie, but we'll get to that later. In the second time, Mr. Freeze shows up in Batman 66. He's played by Otto Preminger, and holy eyebrows. So this is the Mr. Freeze I remember. He's trapping Batman and Robin in snow cones, like giant snow cones, and that's what they have to escape. But he's bald, and he has these bright orange bushy eyebrows. Like holy eyebrows, Batman. And but he doesn't have the helmet on. He has this ice ring kind of thing. Like his suit sends like an ice collar, basically, which keeps him cool. Really cool concept and things like that. And we kind of get that same iteration of the suit when we get the third person who played Mr. Freeze, Eli Walch. And he's more looks like if Ice Miser like showed up like a live action, this is what we got. So we start to see that DC just didn't know what to do with their villains at the time. It was give me a villain of the week, and we're going to see what happens. So we actually don't see Mr. Freeze again until 2 years after the show, but we didn't see him again until 10 years after his first appearance. That's how spotty DC was with their villains, and it's like, well, we'll just see what happens. All right, cool. And so they create characters that have these gimmicks, and then they move on the other because they know it's going to get old if they do the same old. And so that was kind of the pattern for Mr. Freeze. You saw it early on in the comic books. You saw that in the TV show. We didn't really get Mr. Freeze, and the Mr. Freeze that I think is a game changer, which separates Mr. Freeze from some of the other villains, and it really brings Mr. Freeze into his own till we hit Batman the Animated Series. So Batman the Animated Series throws out the script of this gimmicky Mr. Freeze, and they bring us into a brand new origin story. And this is where we get introduced to the linchpin that makes Mr. Freeze work. If you tell a Mr. Freeze story and this part isn't involved in the story, I don't think it's going to work as well as it should. And that linchpin is Nora Freeze. Gang! Nora Freeze first appeared in Batman the Animated Series, and it was the best move that the Batman writers could do for Mr. Freeze's character. Because what it did by introducing Nora Freeze, it gives us depth to the character. He's not just a gimmicky character anymore of, I have an ice gun and I'm going to freeze stuff. But there's a purpose to who he is and why he does what he does. And we're going to talk about how you can still change up the iterations of Mr. Freeze with that when we talk about the comics. But Heart of Ice changed the game when we're talking about Mr. Freeze, and that's all because of Nora Freeze, Victor Freeze's wife. Mr. Freeze is voiced by Michael Ansara, and gang, he has the best voice ever. When I picture Mr. Freeze, when I read a Mr. Freeze comic, I'm hearing Mr. Freeze talk like that. It's this robotic, cold, like, oh my goodness, I was going to like try and do an impression right there, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to do it any justice, and you're going to just sit there and be like, well, that was stupid, that's not that great. But if you watch the animated series, you know what I'm talking about, this kind of chill, robotic, human, like, it's such a weird mix, but it's so perfect for Mr. Freeze that you hear his voice and you get chills. Like, I'm not even doing this as like a pun. You go, whoa, like, that's dope. I mean, when we're talking Batman villains, obviously Mark Hamill's Joker, I'm putting Michael Ansara, Mr. Freeze right underneath that because the voice work was fantastic. So props to the voicing cast director of the Batman the Animated Series because they nailed it a lot of the time. But Heart of Ice is heralded as one of the best Batman the Animated Series show. If you see a channel and they're doing a Batman Top 10 animated episodes and they don't have Heart of Ice on there, don't watch that show because they don't know what they're talking about. It's a great episode. And this is where we start to see the character of who Mr. Freeze is as everything he does now hinges on what he's trying to do for Nora, right? She has a rare disease, McGregor syndrome. I don't know if it's McGregor in the show. I forget. I know that's what it is in Batman and Robin movie. But she has this rare disease, and so she's cryogenically frozen. In that process, Mr. Victor Freeze is trying to heal her, and find a cure for her. And the lab where he's operating at in this episode gets shut down because they're like, you're hemorrhaging us money, like it doesn't work. And Victor's like, I'm just trying to save my wife. And there's a scuffle between the CEO and Victor. Victor gets thrown into this explosion where he then gets the cryogenic freezes, but it freezes his body kind of, and that's why then he has to be in this suit. So in this episode, he thinks Nora Freeze is dead, and he's going out to kind of on a revenge of, you murdered my wife, I was just trying to save her, now you've put me in this, and I'm going to take vengeance on anyone who's done me wrong. And that's why I'm saying, you have Nora Freeze, you have now given Mr. Freeze a purpose and a narrative for him to follow, and I think that's awesome and is what is needed. Mr. Freeze was such a popular character, especially with the Batman the Animated Series, that he was in the second animated movie that they made. So the first animated movie they did was Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which most Batman fans love it and cherish it, and I do as well. Batman and Mr. Freeze Sub-Zero is not a bad one either. It was supposed to originally be released summer of 1997, but another movie with Batman and Mr. Freeze got released that time frame and did not do too well. So Warner Brothers like, we're going to take this straight to DVD video movie and put it to straight to home video, and we're going to put it another time later down. So it got released in like March of 1998. But it was a really great story where we're seeing more of the struggle that Mr. Freeze is going in, and he just wants to be, a recluse basically with his wife, and it's only when people come and interrupt him and cause Nora pain that he's like, well, shoot, now I gotta be Mr. Freeze again. So, but the Batman Sub-Zero movie, it's on HBO Max. Go check it out if you haven't watched it. It's a lot of fun, really cool. You get some really good Batgirl moments in that movie as well. And then, gang, we got Batman and Robin. This was the first live action that we get to see Mr. Freeze. And it doesn't work. I get it. It doesn't work. And I'm not going to sit here and defend Batman and Robin. But I will say this. I was 12 years old when Batman and Robin came out. So I'm sitting there in the theater, and everything that Batman and Robin did worked really well for me as a 12-year-old. I get it. I go back and watch it now, and I'm like, oh, it's not that. But I still watch it because I still enjoy it. I have fun with it. And I think it still is fun for what it is. Take it as a part of Batman culture, but Gang, it's not a good movie. I get it, but it's going to always be hard for me to separate my nostalgia as a 12-year-old getting to watch a live-action Batman movie. It's always going to have a place in my heart. Not as much as Batman Forever because I think it's far superior. As you know, we've talked about that before as well. But it's a classic cliche of Arnold Schwarzenegger was a huge name, and that's what the Batman movies did. They cast big names in the villain roles. I mean, you look at the Batman series, Tim Burton's Batman, Jack Nicholson is cast as the lead, and he's promoted as the main lead over Batman. The movie's called Batman, and Michael Keaton's second billing to the villain. Again, Arnold Schwarzenegger is top billing when you look at this movie. George Clooney was second tier. And I think what they did was they got one of the biggest names in the late 90s and said, hey, we're going to make you Mr. Freeze, even if it doesn't work at all as a character. And so there's flaws, I get it. Arnold Schwarzenegger is not a great Mr. Freeze in the least bit, but I still have fun watching it. I'm probably the only one, but hey, it is what it is. So let's talk about the comics now, okay? We've talked about Mr. Freeze in pop culture, and we could talk about him in the TV show Gotham and in the Arkham Asylum games and Arkham City. But I want to get to the comics because this is my favorite part of the show, because this is where I give you suggestions of you want to dig deeper into the character and who the character is. Go. And if you've watched these videos before, you know I always like to start out with their first appearance. So I'm going to recommend Batman 121 and Detective Comics 373. Those are the first and second appearance of Mr. Freeze in comic books. And the creators behind that are Gardner Fox. You had Gil Khan on that. You had Sid Green. You had Chick Stone. And again, the first appearance in Batman 121, he's called Mr. Zero. So he's a villain who has a freeze gun, and he's robbing stuff, and there's not a lot of depth to the character. And like I said, Detective Comics 373, you get a switch a little bit because they call it Mr. Freeze. And it's funny, there's even a panel where you can see in the panel where Robin and Batman are driving in the Batmobile. And he's like, we're going after Mr. Zero. Or he's like, we're going after Mr. Freeze, formerly known as Mr. Zero. And Robin's kind of like, they changed his name? He changed his name? That sounds like something silly they would do on a TV show. Like, completely bashing the 66 TV show in the comic books. And that's what's so crazy about the Batman 66 show is it was so popular, but then like it jumped the shark so quick that then even the comic books are like, now we're going to separate ourselves from the Batman 66 show, that they're making fun of it in the comic book. So it actually mentions that in like a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, and I think it's really cool. And I have the Toys R Us variant of 121. I need to get my hands on a Batman 121 and a Detective 373 because I love Mr. Freeze so much. But gang, I think that it's important to read those books so you get an understanding of where Mr. Freeze was and what he was originally designed for. Because then I think you're going to appreciate where he is now so much more. So the second book I'm recommending to you is Batman Mr. Freeze by Paul Deeney, Mark Buckingham, and Wayne Foughtcher. And this book I brought up in a previous episode, my Batman first appearances, key comic books that, of characters that popped up in Batman the Animated Series, because this is the first appearance of Nora Freeze. And I think this is very important for us as comic book readers because this is basically the retelling of Heart of Ice, the TV show, but in comic book form. And it goes a little bit more in depth. It gives us a little bit more background between Mr. Freeze, or between Victor Freeze and Nora Freeze. Gives us a little bit of his home life, which is kind of messed up. And I think that helps us shape our view a little bit more of who Victor Freeze is and why he is who he is. And I think it's a very good read for you to get into. This is the origin story of who Mr. Freeze is. You can go the route where Mr. Freeze is like, I'm just trying to rob stuff and steal things so I can, provide and make money and save my wife. Or you can kind of go the resentful, vengeful side of Mr. Freeze where he's like, I hate everyone because what society has done to my wife. But I think you can go either route. So you can go where you sympathize with the character a little bit more, where you go, ooh, he's messed up. But I think it's important that you have Nora Freeze in there because she helps shape that no matter which way you want to take it. I think another great comic that kind of tells that same Mr. Freeze and that story arc is kind of that same genre is Batman the Animated Series, the Holiday Special Annual, created again by Paul Deeney and Glenn Murakami. And This is the story, just like any annual, you get other ones, other stories that pop up. And so you have a Clayface pop up, you have a Harley and Poison Ivy story and a Joker story, and they're good. But the best one is a Mr. Freeze. And this is that iconic cover of Mr. Freeze in the helmet, and you see Batgirl and Batman in the reflection. Collectors love this comic because it's such a great cover, and it's such a great story. This is where you get Mr. Freeze is in jail, and he's in Arkham Asylum, just kind of sitting there, and he's broken out finally. The day before Christmas, he breaks out, and Batman's going there to investigate. He's like, what's going on? Have you seen any changes in, Victor Freeze before this? And, why? And she's like, no, the only thing that kind of got weird, a week before he broke out, he was asking us what the weather was going to be like this week. Is it snowing? And we're like, no, and things like that. And that was kind of it. And so Batman's going, and he's trying to then find Victor Freeze. And he's easy able to find Mr. Freeze because Mr. Freeze leaves a trail of ice everywhere he goes. And so Batman finally finds him in the cemetery. And there's this really cool fight between Mr. Freeze and Batman gets knocked into a gravestone, and it's his parents' gravestone, which is holy emotional feels right there. But then Batman obviously gets the upper hand on Mr. Freeze, and he's like, why? Victor, of all these times, why did you pick Christmas Eve to come out here to cause havoc? Because he was on route to this mission, and he was, leaving people and everything in his destruction because he was a path. Batman's just like, why? And Victor's like, we're on the anniversary of, for Nora and myself, and on our anniversary, it was snowing. And when I found out there wasn't going to be snow today, I knew it would make her sad, and so I just wanted to make her happy. Holy cow, that you might say that, I'm like, well, that's cheesy, that's hokey, but to me, that tells you why Nora is such an important character to Victor Freeze, because he has such a passion and love for his wife that he would do anything, even to think that he can make his deceased wife happy by just having it snow. That's the story that I love in a Mr. Freeze, because the relationship between Nora and Victor is so powerful that it drives him to do anything for that relationship. And now that's where we get the little couple of the sympathetic side. This is where I'm going to give you a couple recommendations now where you're like, ooh, Mr. Freeze, you wild. Because it also, Nora can also be a linchpin for him to go and be cause vengeance and cause suffering on people. And we see this in Gotham Central in the first issues, the issues 1 and 2. We get a Mr. Freeze storyline, and this is done by Greg Rucka, Ed Brubaker, Michael Lark, and gang. It is an awesome read. This is what I imagine Gotham was originally pitched, the TV show, was to be a Gotham Central kind of vibe, more of where it's a police procedural and not very much Batman in it. And this story opens up with these two detectives who are going on a bust, and they get this, tip that there might be this guy that they've been looking for there. Well, sadly, it's not the guy they were looking for. It's Mr. Freeze, and it's just coincidence that he was there, and it was just a bad tip. And Mr. Freeze just ices the dude's hand to a gun, so it's messed up, and he literally freezes the other detective and knocks him over, and you just see pieces of the detective on the ice. He has no care for anybody. He's just straight ill will towards everyone who's wronged him, society, the police, and he's on a vengeance, gang. And it's so cool to kind of see this kind of detective story in the world of Gotham without Batman there. The police even go to the mayor's office, don't turn on the bat signal. Mr. Freeze messed with our people. He messed with our police brother, and we don't want Batman in on this. We're going to solve this on our own. And so you get to see this kind of detective story unfold as they're trying to figure out all these things of how did Mr. Freeze get there? Why was he there? And just a really cool story. I'm not going to spoil any more. Go read Gotham Central issues 1 and 2 if you haven't. And the last one I'm going to recommend to you is Batman Annual from the New 52. And this is done by Scott Snyder. James Tynan the Fourth and Jason Fabok, and gang, woo-wee, let's go. It's so freaking good. Where you're like, oh, it's another origin story, but with just a little bit of a different twist. But gang, Scott and James, they twist it really good. And this is where it drives it a little bit more. He might be a little bit more of a psychopath. And it's like, man, this is dark. And I think it works either way, that you have Nora, involved in this story, but you can go the sympathetic route of you understand why he's doing it, and you can go the route of, oh, Mr. Freeze, you're just crazy. So gang, that's it. Those are the comics I'm going to recommend to you to check out if you want to read more about Mr. Freeze. With that being said, I hope you guys are still enjoying these Batman villain profile videos. I love making them. I love researching them and doing these for you. Make sure if you're new, watch the other ones like I said, and let me know in the comments, who do you want to see a villain profile on next? I do listen to the comments because some of y'all have shaped it a little bit to say, I want to see this. So if I haven't done a villain profile yet on your favorite villain, let me know, and I'll make that happen here sooner than later, hopefully. But with that being said, hopefully you can find some time to curl up, grab a book, and nerd out. Peace.